As we've talked about in the last few videos, you have the invasion of Poland by the Nazis in September of 1939. And from there on out, for the next roughly 2 years, it looks like the Axis powers are only getting more and more momentum. As we go through 1940 and 1941, more and more of Europe seems to fall to the Axis powers. And so their momentum seems to be accelerating. But we saw that near the end of, or mid-1941, going into the end of 1941, the Axis powers, you have Japan at the end of 1941 attacking Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States, a major world power, into the war. You have Germany in mid-1941 going after the Soviet Union, breaking their pact with the Soviet Union, going after another world power, now having to deal with the British in the West, having to deal with the Soviet Union in the East, and the Americans are also going to get involved not just in the Pacific, but in Europe as well. And so as we go into 1942, we see the tide starts turning, and I'll draw that, I'll make this part of the timeline a little bit more blue. And so now we are entering 1943, and that turning of the tide only accelerates. In early 1943, in January of 1943, the Americans are able to start doing bombing raids on Germany. And we talked in the last video, when we talked about 1942, about the Guadalcanal campaign, how the Japanese had taken Guadalcanal, the island of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, and a few other islands, and they were using that as a base of operations. They were building an airfield that could be used to disrupt traffic between the Allies and Australia. And so the U.S. mounted an offensive to take those islands, and not only were they able to take those islands, but they were able to prevent the Japanese from reconquering those islands. And so Guadalcanal is often cited as the campaign as when the Allies were really able to go on the offensive. And as we're in early 1943, the Americans are able to kind of clear out Guadalcanal, make it, make it very clear that the Japanese really can't contest it. And then they really, as we'll see in a few minutes, really, they're going to really be able to go on the offensive in the Pacific. Now, as we go further through the year, once again, momentum keeps building for the Allies. We're in 1943. In February of 1943, the Germans surrender in Stalingrad. Stalingrad, one of the most epic and bloody and horrible battles in military history. The Germans lose here. Stalingrad is kind of reduced to rubble, but now the Germans are on their heels. The Germans are starting to be pushed back, pushed out of the Soviet Union. Leningrad, however, is still under siege. And this is, if you have a strong stomach, you could look up pictures on the siege of Leningrad. The siege of Stalingrad is also horrible. But it will make you ill, but it'll give you a sense of, I'm doing these overview videos with just arrows and coloring things. You don't get a full appreciation for just how dark and disturbing war was and how it affected the lives of civilians. And if you really want to get a flavor for that, a very bad flavor for that, look up the siege of Leningrad. But that is still going. And Stalingrad, once again, there's movies about it, and it's actually a pretty incredible story about how the Soviets were really on their heels on Stalingrad, but how they were able to mount a counter-offensive by going at the flanks of the German army and kind of pushing them back and forcing them to surrender. So this is, there's a reason why there are many movies about the siege of Stalingrad. But then as we get into spring of 1943, once again, more momentum. We already talked about in 1942 the British being able to push the Axis powers back out of Egypt and into Libya, and that momentum continues. And at the end of 1942, we talked about Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria. These armies are able to meet up in the spring of 1943 and essentially kick the Axis out of North Africa. So 1943, North Africa goes North Africa, North African victory for Allies. Victory for the Allies. And then they're able to use this as a base of operations to invade or to attack Italy. So in July of 1943, you have the invasion of Sicily. And then you have actually going to the Italian mainland, Salerno. So this is all happening in 1943, which causes mid-year for Mussolini and the fascists to be deposed in Italy. So this is a big deal. So you have a Mussolini is deposed. Mussolini. My handwriting isn't so nice. Mussolini is deposed. And when you get to September of 1943, Italy formally surrenders to the Allied powers. And if we go to the Eastern Front, as we go into November, the Soviets are able to push all the way back, are able to keep pushing the Germans back, keep pushing the Axis powers back. They're able to take back Kiev. And as we go into the end of 1943, the Soviets are on the verge of re-invading Poland. So you can see what is going on. And as we look at the Pacific, if we look at the Pacific right over here, the United States is really starting to go on the offensive, to really take back many of these island groups in the Pacific. And these campaigns start as we're in the end of 1943. Take back the Marshall Islands, Gilbert Islands, Caroline Islands, Mariana Islands, the Eastern Solomon, or I should say the Western Solomon Islands. And as you can imagine, the value of these is, one, you take them back from the Japanese. It keeps the Japanese from using these islands as a launching point to attack the Allies. But it also allows the Allies to get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, so that hopefully it forces the Japanese into a surrender. But as we'll see as we go into 1944, that is easier said than done. The Japanese do not surrender so easily, and we get into bloodier and bloodier campaigns as we go into 1944 and 1945 in the Pacific, even though the writing is on the wall that Japan is not likely to win World War II. In fact, it becomes very clear as we go into 1944 and 1945 that they won't, but it's very hard for the Americans or for the Allies to force a surrender there.